All right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Jessie Turner, and I'm the project manager for the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. And I'm very honored and really excited, actually, to be here with you today and grateful for your time participating in this important discussion. So today's webinar is Accounting for OA Across Vulnerability and Risk Assessments. And really it's a starting point, we hope, for more discussions on this topic across our membership and interested partners. The presentations selected represent different approaches for thinking through how to put together these types of assessments, really who commissions them, how they might impact or help inform policy priorities and strategies. So as many of you know, the Alliance aims to support decision makers in really better understanding climate impacts to marine resources and further to implement actions that reduce these impacts, but also increase biodiversity and resilience of communities, of humans, and of ecosystems. And while we do need to reduce carbon emissions, of course, the number one cause of ocean acidification, there are actions that governments and non-government partners can be taking now that will help inform and prioritize these local actions. So today's webinar is really a chance to get started and help frame this discussion by providing a snapshot of assessments that have already been conducted or are being conducted, and highlight some of the strategies, methodologies, and lessons learned as we go. One thing to note, it's important that today's presentations are not holistic of the body of work on this subject and do not include all relevant projects. So for example, US NOAA has recently commissioned 3 different regional vulnerability assessments that include a Northeast focus on scallops, Chesapeake Bay focus on oysters, California current focus on socioeconomic impacts and human dimensions of ocean acidification. Studies led by researchers with the Swinomish Indian tribal community have looked at the linkages between indigenous community health and climate change using like integrated indicators. Many handbooks, policy briefs from around the world have increasingly outlined potential methodologies and approaches to this work, and want to highlight that very recently or soon to be released, the Commonwealth Blue Charter OA Working Group has released a policy handbook that will talk about these approaches to risk and vulnerability assessments. But today, again, is a starting point, and we'll be planning to host several more discussions on the subject, increasingly sharing these case studies, experiences across our membership, which really includes all of you. And ultimately, we believe that accounting for the increasing acidification, these cumulative impacts of ocean climate change, governments and communities can more accurately assess the economic, cultural, and social vulnerabilities directly caused by CO2 emissions. And then we need to be able to strategize actions that support food security and sovereignty, increase resilience of marine ecosystems, and of course, build the sustainable ocean economy as we all go forward in the face of future change. So without further ado, I'll just quickly share this overview of the agenda with you all. As you can see, we are very lucky today. We've got Dr. Sarah Cooley, Director of Climate Science at Ocean Conservancy, here to talk about the difference between risk and vulnerability, help us describe methodologies that have been put forward by the IPCC, and potential applications of these efforts. Dr. Joanna Johnson, Director of C2O Pacific, is going to describe a case study from the Pacific Islands region, a vulnerability assessment that was commissioned in 2015 and has continued to inform and frame subsequent work. Dominic Sigg with British Columbia Climate Action Secretariat will describe how ocean acidification has shown up within the province's broader climate risk assessment. Dr. Jan Newton will describe an ongoing project along the Pacific coast of North America that is intentionally taking this integrated social ecological approach to help lay the foundation for future presentations around this project. You know, the Alliance would like to keep engaging the takeaways and lessons learned and experiences from this project, and do some more programming around this unique project later on this year. And then finally, we'll be joined by Dr. Naira Shaltut from the National Institute of Oceanography and Fisheries in Egypt for a roundtable discussion with other presenters, and take some questions from you all joining today. So from there, just to set everybody's expectations, we have 90 minutes and several presentations to get through before we go into a panel discussion. So Sarah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. All right, I'll get your slides up here and let's see. Okay. All right, very thrilled to have you go ahead and let's see, take it away.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thank you. There we are.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, I'm Sarah Cooley, and I will talk to you a little bit about some fundamentals of risk and vulnerability analysis. Next slide, please, Jessie. So risk and vulnerability often get rolled together in common language, but really when we think about it rigorously, risk is an integrated measure. The IPCC defines it as the potential for harmful consequences for human or ecological systems. And they note that climate-related risk can come from the impacts of climate change, as well as the human responses to climate change, because risk really depends on the combination of what's shown in this figure, which is vulnerability, hazard, and exposure. Hazard and exposure are slightly more straightforward ideas than vulnerability. So in the IPCC Special Report for Oceans and for the Oceans and Cryosphere, commonly known as SROC or SROC. In the glossary, they refer to hazard briefly as a natural or human-induced event that can cause harm to the things that humans value. Now, they also define exposure as essentially the presence of people or assets in places that could be harmed. And vulnerability is a little more complex. It's the possibility of being harmed. So vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts that include sensitivity to harm and the lack of capacity to cope and adapt. So you can see that vulnerability and risk involve at minimum multiple variables with different measurement systems. And these variables can span different geographic or temporal scales. Next slide, please. The IPCC risk framework shown on the previous slide is a really useful framework to think about how we assess climate risk and vulnerability. There's no set protocol to follow, so assessments depend on a wide variety of data as well as expert judgment of how different parameters relate to each other. Some useful background reading, though, I can recommend is the body of work that has come before, and it starts with the IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events published in 2012. And then there's a lot of other IPCC products that refer back to that and build upon that. Another thing that helps is to consider what makes up risk. So in general, risk is the combined outcome of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, like we showed on the last slide. And climate risk to a marine asset is often located in some kind of biophysical environmental hazard, like acidification. But vulnerability and exposure of human communities to the climate risk are really rooted in the makeup of the human communities and the choices made by those human communities as they depend on the marine resource. So decreasing their risk basically involves decreasing hazards, vulnerabilities, or exposure. But how that gets done is very, very site and system specific. So for the example of acidification risk to shellfish aquaculture in Alaska in the United States, your hazard is broadly ocean acidification. But the temporal and spatial characteristics of acidification contribute to that hazard. And the vulnerability of Alaska communities to this really depends on the factors that are hard to classify as vulnerability or exposure. This could include things like how diverse other aquaculture fisheries are in the area, how many jobs depend on aquaculture compared to other sectors. And it's also really important to avoid double counting certain factors as part of that. I'll show you in a moment how our Alaska vulnerability assessment, we used related but slightly different measures. And really what we think about is, we want to minimize these three items, vulnerability, hazard, and exposure, which is what's shown on this slide. But there's another way to think about lowering risk. Next slide, please. So, lowering risk and decreasing vulnerability and exposure can also involve increasing a community's adaptive capacity by boosting their overall wealth, health, literacy, and job security. So, assessing risk comprehensively also requires thinking about positive factors that help lift or reduce your risk and offset vulnerability and exposure. So, that can be kind of confusing to think about. And I'm trying to show it a little bit on the next slide to go ahead. Next slide, please, and think about this. So this is the logic model. You don't have to take away the whole logic model. It's well described in the paper in 2015. We used it for our risk assessment for the state of Alaska. We created this unitless risk index because we wanted to look at differences between communities. And a key piece of the information we used was subsistence harvest information. So we could really look at dependence on these things. But then we also looked at variables related to adaptive capacity. So everything identified with the caption or the bracket and the balloons, these are things that sort of lift risk or increase adaptive capacity of a community. These are things that increase overall health, wealth, and education. So they're kind of lightening the vulnerability measure in a way of speaking. Next slide, please. In that analysis, we did find that adaptive capacity varied very widely among different boroughs in Alaska. And this happened in addition to regional variations in economic and nutritional importance of shellfish that could be affected by acidification, and in addition to differences in economic and nutritional dependence on these species. So in some ways, when you're trying to roll everything up, there's positive factors and negative factors that sort of either contribute to risk or offset some risk. Next slide, please. So building an index like we did is very, very difficult. And sometimes it's a terrible idea because of the temporal and spatial challenges associated with the information you're trying to combine. Data gaps are a really big concern. So here in this graphic, I'm trying to show how hazard information is often available at really broad scales. So at the top of this graphic, but really what we know is that microenvironments and very local factors dictate the conditions that govern, thrive, a marine species thriving or failing. And so that's a big assumption we made usually, and you kind of have to make often, that basin scale trends apply to local scale environments where species sensitive to acidification are found. Also, timescales of data sets don't align very well. We can use Earth system models to either forecast or hindcast conditions, but a lot of times harvest data don't line up very well with other data about human communities. And all of these data can be patchy. Sampling intervals vary greatly. So we wind up averaging over larger timescales like decades, which really decreases how much predictive power your study actually has. And there are lag times that can obscure kind of the cause and effect relationships. Other events can really affect what's happening. For example, an economic recession, changes in state policies, even global seafood market factors can really affect the way that local communities depend on a particular resource. So in all, it's kind of a miracle when you can create an index. You'll notice that in another study I was part of, 2015 nationwide ocean acidification risk assessment for the United States, the data didn't allow us to actually create a quantitative index. We had to really content ourselves with presenting the factors that contributed to risk in the same place and allow readers to draw their own conclusions regionally by weighing the information that we presented. And really using their local knowledge to interpret how different factors could be adjusted regionally. We could still really draw conclusions, though, about which factors were more concerning in each region. And it really led to some useful regionally focused conversations about next steps. So identifying and mapping the component factors really provided us with a great deal of insight. Next slide, please. So this is what the final data presentation looked like in that nationwide project. You can immediately see how in the different regions shown, the variables differ. And in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, the water chemistry threshold we chose won't be reached for quite a long time, but there's a great deal of social vulnerability. And these sorts of differences were what informed our messages that we circulated with policymakers and other resource managers. Next slide, please. These are examples of the materials that we shared with decision makers. So even when analyses don't roll up into a tidy summary or a number, they can be very, very useful for decision makers. Looking at those regional differences that emerged in our nationwide study that I showed in the last slide, we were able to really develop some brochures for policymakers that explained the regional differences and tendencies that we saw. So for example, each of the fact sheets shown on the right explain the regional characteristics that increase local risk to shellfish industry loss from ocean acidification. Next slide, please. So in order to inform decision-making with these sorts of studies, it's important to remember what the studies offer. They really provide decision-relevant information that covers many systems. The information really spans natural systems, cultural systems, and economic systems, as well as policy landscapes. These studies also offer priorities for research and action and investments and policy development. So the example that I showed before, in the US example, we really could see that coastal nutrient runoff that provided or that contributed to algal overgrowth was a really important priority in some of the areas we looked at. And that's like a co-occurring factor making acidification worse. And then finally, these studies offer suggestions about which particular policies can offset risk. Maybe the set of policies focus more on boosting the social fabric of a community, or maybe the policies focus on water quality. But you can really tell that after you've completed one of these studies that brings together all this information. Next slide, please. So I want to leave you with a few ideas and food for thought. There's a number of examples of durable environmental policy that have happened over the last decades. And we know that the real characteristics of policies that are durable are that they involve inclusion and partnerships and co-production of knowledge. So governments really need to do this work of developing strategies to prepare for acidification as a core feature of their climate work, but in a way that engages communities. So it's absolutely important to come up with regionally specific steps. It's also good to consider that factors that lower adaptive capacity, or the things that I flagged with balloons that would help lift some of the burden of risk, they're a key piece of adaptation. They might not be ocean focused at all, and that's perfectly fine. And then finally, we want revised policies to be like multi-tools. They should do a number of things at once to reduce risk. They should build adaptive capacity, decrease exposure, and decrease vulnerability. And at the same time, they need to be focusing on increasing equity and justice rather than simply leaning on established pathways that depend on powerful or privileged actors. So those are just some ideas to get you started in terms of thinking about how risk and vulnerability can play a part in your area as you think about acting on acidification. That's all I have for today. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions when Jessie says we're ready for questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Really appreciate it. And what a great way to set the table and move into our next presentation. So, Dr. Joanna Johnson, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Lovely. And let's go ahead. I'll get your slides up here.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Hello, everyone. That was a wonderful introduction by Sarah, and really appreciate the scene setting, because I'm going to take many of the concepts that she's introduced around vulnerability and the factors that contribute to vulnerability and share with you a project we did assessing the vulnerability of Pacific Island countries and territories to ocean acidification. So this work was done a little while ago, and I have my collaborators up there, Dr. Johan Bell and Alex Gupta. And like I said, it was about a regional vulnerability assessment for the tropical Pacific Island region. So that's 22 islands, island countries and territories in the, I guess what you call the Southern Pacific Ocean. If we can have the next slide, please, Jessie. So I just want to give you a brief overview of the methodology and how we, the purpose of the project, the background to it, how we ran the vulnerability assessment, some of the focus areas and the components that we assessed, and also the findings and recommendations, because that's been important in some next steps and applying the findings, the regional hotspots, and as I said, some of the applications. Next slide, please. So it is a very large area that we were looking at. It's that tropical Pacific Island region between Australia and across to Pitcairn Island is the furthest east islands. It also includes Micronesia, but not Hawaii. And you can see there on the map some of the ocean acidification projections under RCP 8.5. So that's a high emission scenario into the future. So business as usual, very little mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And the projections for the Pacific there based on the historic. So the upper map shows us the historic conditions between 1986 and 2005, and then look forward to 2060 under this high emission scenarios and how ocean chemistry is projected to change. So essentially we were looking to understand what that meant for these Pacific Island nations, which are obviously very small island nations, or in another way you can describe them as large ocean states. So what happens in their ocean is critically important to their food sources, their livelihoods, as well as government economic revenue. Identify the most vulnerable components and the source of this vulnerability, and then try and understand what this meant for monitoring, policy and planning, so that we could provide some recommendations for governments and also regional agencies that could potentially look at minimising vulnerability through local adaptation. Next slide, please. So we used a framework very similar to what we just saw in the previous presentation from the IPCC. This is the one, the framework that precedes the one we just saw. So risk isn't included, or hazard, but let me just say that actually hazard was considered as part of the assessment. Hazard is essentially in this framework embedded in exposure. So the hazard in this case, as we've heard, is ocean acidification, and certainly that was embedded in one of our variables for exposure. And then along with sensitivity contributing to potential impacts, then adaptive capacity, and I really love that balloon analogy, is a positive thing. If you have high adaptive capacity, it can actually temper the potential impacts of, in this case, ocean acidification. Ultimately, all of those things combine to give you a measure of vulnerability. And by unpackaging it this way and using indicators and criteria for each of these components of exposure, sensitivity and adaptive capacity, we were able to understand what the drivers of vulnerability were, and also then provide some recommendations of adaptation options that can address those drivers. So that is minimize exposure or sensitivity, or enhance adaptive capacity. And I think Sarah described this really well, and in particular the fact that building adaptive capacity is usually and often social factors. They're not necessarily related to the sector specifically or to some environmental driver. They are often underlying social factors that can be addressed through adaptation actions. Next slide, please. So here's this map again showing the historic ocean chemistry conditions for the Pacific region, and then the projected conditions in 2060. So the projections under this high emissions scenario were for a 0.3 decline in pH. What does that mean? Well, essentially the ocean chemistry is really important for many organisms that live in there. There's certain compounds that are either available or not available for organisms to use, particularly those that take up chemicals from the ocean and build their skeletons or their shells. And we call that the aragonite saturation, and certainly that was projected to decline by 2060 for that region, making it marginal for calcification. So this map actually shows aragonite saturation, and you can see that scale on the right, that there's a lot of studies that have already established what is optimal. So what are the optimal levels of aragonite saturation for organisms to take up chemicals from the water and build shells and skeletons, and that optimal range is 4 to 4.5. And then as you move down the scale, it becomes adequate, low, and then extremely marginal. And that 2.5 to 3 range for aragonite saturation is considered extremely marginal, meaning that many organisms cannot grow and cannot use chemicals from the ocean to build their skeletons or shells. So you can see that the projections are that, you know, many parts of the tropical Pacific region are heading towards that red zone or that low and extremely marginal area for calcification. So this could have significant biological implications, and that's what we were interested to look at, and what this meant ultimately for nations and for communities that depend on ocean resources. Next slide, please. So this is a region, as I said, a very large region out as far east as the Pitcairn Islands. So it's only the shaded nations that were part of the assessment. So you can see it does go into the Northern Marianas Islands, Guam, Marshall Islands, so Micronesia, but not into as far north as Hawaii or, you know, parts of Japan. We also included obviously all the islands in Melanesia, so Papua New Guinea, Solomons, New Caledonia, Vanuatu and Fiji, and then all of the Polynesian nations. So that's 22 Pacific Island countries and territories. And as you can see, again, very small land areas and very large ocean areas. So what happens in the ocean is critically important for almost everything that these governments and communities do. Next slide, please. So we looked at a number of different components. We looked at habitats, so marine habitats such as coral reefs, but also seagrass and mangroves. We looked at coastal fisheries that depend on these habitats for finfish, as well as for invertebrates such as sea cucumbers, clams, different invertebrates that communities depend on for food or to sell. Also looked at oceanic fisheries, because tuna in particular, there are 4 species of tuna that are targeted in this part of the Pacific, and they are critically important in terms of revenue and economic development of these nations, and certainly the largest fishery across all of these 22 countries. If you could keep clicking, please, Jessie, sorry. We also looked at aquaculture, in particular things like growth of seaweeds in nearshore waters, income, so the implications for jobs and livelihoods and income for small-scale fisheries. And then finally, we looked at the implications for economic revenue and what that means for national governments. Next slide, please.
Dr. Johnson, I'll just give you about a 5-minute or so warning, just to give you a pacing sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
So some of the key findings in terms of the marine resources, so having assessed all of these elements, some key resources came up as being particularly vulnerable. So we did use a series of indicators. You would have seen that lovely flowchart that Dr. Cooley showed us earlier. We had a lot of different indicators and a lot of different criteria, and ultimately we ended up with semi-quantitative results that told us which resources were most vulnerable to ocean acidification and exposure to that hazard that was projected to 2060. So coral reefs, and you can see them listed here. So these are the most vulnerable marine resources, and most of them are calcifying. As you said, you know, they build skeletons such as corals that then obviously build the structure of coral reefs, or things like mollusks, so, you know, clams and the like, sea cucumbers. They all depend on the ocean chemistry or compounds from the ocean to build their skeletons and shells. So they obviously were the most vulnerable. as were reef fish, because they obviously depend on coral reefs critically for their habitat, for shelter and food, and for breeding grounds. So these were the most vulnerable marine resources. We then took that the next step, and obviously you can see through from the impacts and also which Pacific nations are most likely to be affected because they are critically dependent on these resources. Next slide, please. So then we looked at food security. So what does that mean if those marine resources are going to be impacted by ocean acidification? And you can click through all these, Jessie. And exposure, looked at things like population growth and also dependence on reef fish for food. So the amount of reef fish consumed in different nations as a primary protein source. So there was nutritional factors included in there. That was in sensitivity, and then the capacity to adapt. And again, as we've heard, capacity to adapt is often social factors, so things like current health conditions, education levels, governance, and size of the economy. Next slide, thanks. And what we ended up with was with 3 groups, and they were 3 groups that are either not very vulnerable in terms of their food security to what ocean acidification will mean for marine resources, through to those groups that are most vulnerable. So group 1 was essentially the least vulnerable, and they just needed support to avoid becoming vulnerable over time. So essentially what we're saying is for those island nations that you see listed there, as long that their resources will decline because of climate change and particularly ocean acidification, but they still will be producing enough fish for people to be able to eat going through to 2060 and be able to supply the nutrition that people need. But they want to avoid that changing through other things that might impact on their food source. Next slide, please. Group 2 were those where their coral reefs should be able to provide enough fish needed for food into the future, but it might be difficult for them to be distributed. So there might be impacts in one place, but not another, and then there needs to be some sort of transport system within the country. And these are obviously some of these countries, as you can see listed, they're very dispersed nations, atoll nations, covering very large areas, and getting their fish distributed was a key issue there. So ocean acidification will have a minor impact, and they just need to make sure that they can distribute their fish appropriately for food. Next slide, please. And then the most vulnerable group, group 3, the most concerning group in terms of food security, are listed there. And this is where, because of ocean acidification impacts on coral reefs and reef fish and other invertebrates that they eat, that there wouldn't be enough food produced from the ocean to meet their nutritional needs, and they needed immediate adaptation. And you can see there's a lot of Micronesian nations listed there. Next slide, please. So then we looked at the implications for livelihoods, and you can click through all of these. We found, obviously, as you saw before, the marine resources that are most vulnerable to ocean acidification are those that have shells, so pearls, shrimp, and aquaculture, that essentially these needed alternative income opportunities to shift away from vulnerable resources, including reef fish. So perhaps looking at targeting nearshore tuna or other species that were less vulnerable to ocean acidification. Perhaps shifting mariculture into freshwater ponds, again, away from these nearshore ponds that might be more vulnerable, and marketing alternative ecotourism experiences as coral reefs decline. So livelihoods that were vulnerable, and we had a series of adaptations that could assist with adaptation. Next slide, please. So having understood what meant for reef habitats and coastal habitats, and then all of the organisms that depend on those, and then looking at the different elements of what this means for communities, so coastal protection, food security, and livelihoods, we then actually looked at each of the 22 Pacific Island nations to understand their vulnerability as a nation, which encompasses all of the different elements and all of the different goods and services they get from the ocean, and what does ocean acidification mean for these nations overall. Next slide. So we looked at reef-dependent communities. Next.
And just giving a 2-minute warning.
Yeah. So you can just click through all of these. I didn't realize you'd be driving, so probably best to just keep clicking through. Thank you.
That's fine.
So the assessment, again, looked at the 22 nations and the exposure of reef habitats and fisheries into 2050 to ocean acidification being the hazard, their sensitivity of food security, livelihoods, and their capacity to adapt. And what we found was that the key drivers of vulnerability were if nations had high reef areas, high household income dependence on reef fisheries, and obviously poor governance and small economies. So if you can click next slide. So the most vulnerable communities across the 22 nations to ocean acidification are listed there. This is the top 5, sorry, 6. And you can see again, quite a lot of Micronesian countries. And again, it's because of these high reef areas. They're often atoll nations. They're very dependent on reef fish for their food and their protein source. It's their primary protein source. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of all of those components. And, you know, that layer effect, again, we saw from Dr. Cooley is really important. It was constantly building layers in this assessment. So understanding what it means for the marine resources, and then what does that then mean for the communities and the nations that depend on them. And you can see that obviously some things have very high vulnerability, such as coral reefs and food security. And obviously they're linked, while others have were assessed to have very low vulnerability, like ocean habitats and tuna, although there was a lack of data there, so the confidence is somewhat low in those results. But then this could provide some information for planning and policy into the future. Next slide, please. So some of the recommended adaptations was to target obviously these main sources of vulnerability in the Pacific Island countries and territories that are most vulnerable. So it's that hotspot approach, improve management of reefs, obviously in those hotspot areas, sustain the production of reef fisheries. And this was, you know, using an ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management, diversify away from coastal fisheries because they were projected to be highly vulnerable, increase access to tuna, so as a bycatch product potentially, so that food security can be supplemented.
Sorry, I don't need to do
That's
that.
okay. And again, that could be through bycatch, or it could be just targeting nearshore small pelagic species so that they're moving away from coastal fisheries, improve post-harvest methods, and develop hatcheries and grout systems for freshwater ponds, again, moving away from these vulnerable mariculture species that are particularly susceptible or vulnerable to ocean acidification. Next slide. So the regional hotspots were obviously those that are in the group 3 for food security, meaning they're not going to be producing enough food from their oceans because of ocean acidification to feed their populations. Those communities that are highly reef dependent, and they're listed there. So we needed community-based adaptations for those communities, and those that are particularly dependent on vulnerable aquaculture resources such as pearls and shrimp. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, and this is essentially where this information has gone. So taking that approach of focusing in these hotspots, if you like, so the nations that are most vulnerable, the drivers of that vulnerability, and the component that's most vulnerable, whether that's food security or livelihoods. There's a number of case studies that were started or recommended, and that was to improve the understanding at a more local scale of what ocean acidification means for resources, communities, food security and livelihoods. So one for pearl farming in French Polynesia, because there's definitely an issue there in terms of the pearl quality is reducing over time, and it's postulated to be because of this declining aragonite saturation. They're just not growing as well. And also coral reef fisheries, obviously critically important for protein and as food security source. There's also some pilot studies happening on local monitoring and adaptation actions, looking at things like using seaweeds or other marine plants to buffer the effects of ocean acidification and potentially protect small local areas, or some sort of early warning system, particularly for something again like pearl farming, where they might be able to move their product away if the system is becoming too acidic. And also the information to inform and adjust planning and policy to move away potentially from things like harvesting or mariculture in these highly vulnerable locations, again, specific to ocean acidification. And that's it. Thank you for listening. And thank you, Jessie, for driving the slides. I will, I guess, yeah, be available for questions when it's time.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. It's awesome to have you here and present a hefty undertaking, and important to note that a lot of the takeaways from this vulnerability assessment, which is available to for folks that want to check it out, has been directly informing some of the work happening across some of our other affiliate members at SPREP and Pacific Community and elsewhere, and a great way to show how this vulnerability assessment then got moved forward into further application. Thank you. All right, so now to get a little bit of a different perspective. So that was an example of a government setting out, or a group of intergovernmental group commissioning an OA vulnerability assessment specifically. Our next presentation is going to be from British Columbia, the province of British Columbia in Canada, and give a little bit of an overview about their objective was to do a climate risk assessment for the province and how ocean acidification showed up in that risk assessment. So, Dominique, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. All right, great. Let's go ahead and I'll pull up slides here. Apologies. Oh gosh. All right. Things I can do. All right. All right. All right, can you see that all right? Go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, if you can put it into presenter mode. There we go, thank you. So yeah, thanks, Jessie, and thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. My presentation is going to be a little bit different than some of the other panelists in that, firstly, I'm not an ocean acidification expert. My background is very firmly in conservation biology in the terrestrial realm, and the purpose of our risk assessment was to take very much a provincial scale assessment of climate-related risks that are important to BC, of which ocean acidification was one of the risks that we looked at in the assessment. So next slide, please. Great. So why did we do a climate risk assessment? This was for a couple of reasons. It was in direct response to an Auditor General's report from 2018. The BC Auditor General tabled a report about managing climate risks in British Columbia and said that the province wasn't doing enough to manage its risks. And one of the key recommendations was for the province to do an assessment of what the climate-related risks were for British Columbia. This risk assessment was also a response to a report, a subsequent report from Chief Maureen Chapman and George Abbott, looking at the risks of wildfire and flooding, recent risks. We've had significant wildfires and floods in the last few years in British Columbia, and it was in a response to that report as well. This risk assessment is also helping to shape our climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. My slide here is a little bit out of date. This strategy was to be released last year. However, we had a provincial election, which slowed things down. And so we're hoping that we will be releasing that strategy this year. And that our adaptation strategy is informed in part by the climate risk assessment that I'm going to be talking about today. We also have a new Climate Change Accountability Act that requires the province to report on its climate-related risks and what it's doing to address those risks every year. So the risk assessment, again, is a foundational piece for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the purpose of our risk assessment was to assess, compare, and prioritize potential climate-related risks that have significant impacts in British Columbia. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more in a minute. The risk assessment was published in 2019. We have a couple of documents that are available. The first one is the methodology, the climate risk assessment framework, and then the preliminary strategic climate risk assessment for British Columbia, which includes the assessment of the 15 risks that we looked at. You can find these documents by copying down this very long URL, or you can also just go to your search engine and look for BC Climate Risk Assessment. You will find those documents. Next slide, please. Great. So we used a standardized methodology for assessing risks, the ISO 31000 standard, and adapted it for use with climate change. Our focus, as I said, was on provincially significant risks. So we were interested in things that, the kinds of risks that the province, the provincial government would have a responsibility for responding to. So things like risks to loss of life, widespread injuries or disease, damage to infrastructure, long-term disruption to the economy, significant disruption to daily life, widespread psychological or health impacts, and significant loss of natural and cultural resources. So we used a scenarios-based approach. So we had 15 risks that we assessed, and for each of those risks, we identified a specific scenario in which to quantify the risks that were present. And we used a risk assessment that was based on likelihood and consequence. So we assessed the likelihood of a particular risk event occurring today in the 20-year period around 2010, compared to the likelihood of that risk occurring in the 2050s. And we used consequence and likelihood rating scales to assess each of the risks. Next slide, please. Okay, so we had 15 risk events that we looked at, discrete and ongoing. So we divided these up into, first of all, what you see here is our discrete risk events. So these are stochastic risks that usually require some kind of emergency response. What you see here is for each risk event, in bold is the risk event that we assessed, and following that is the specific risk scenario that we looked at. So in the case of severe riverine flooding, we specifically looked at what's the chance of a 1 in 500 year flood on the Fraser River, which is a major river system in British Columbia that travels through Vancouver. What's the risk of that happening by 2050? Other things we looked at in these discrete risk event categories were the risk of moderate flooding on a smaller waterway, extreme precipitation followed by a landslide, seasonal water shortage, severe coastal storm surge on top of rising sea level, a heat wave, and severe wildfire season. Next slide, please. Okay, so the slow onset or ongoing gradual change risk events that we looked at were long-term water storage, glacier mass loss, ocean acidification is in there. And in this case, we looked at what's the chance of a 0.15 reduction in pH by 2050, which was deemed to be a critical threshold that would significantly impact shellfish on the BC coast. Saltwater intrusion, loss of forest resources, reduction in ecosystem connectivity, an increase in invasive species, and an increased incidence of vector-borne disease. Next slide, please. So for each risk event, we assessed the likelihood of it occurring. So we wanted to know how that changes over time. So like I said, we assessed the present day risk, which is the 20-year period around 2010, and compared that to future risk, which is the 20-year period around the 2050 mark. We used a business as usual global greenhouse gas emissions scenario, so RCP 8.5. I don't really have time to explain our justification for using that in this presentation, but if you're interested to know more about that, I'm happy to discuss that during the discussion period. And I should say for all of these risk events, we analyzed information based on a number of things. So it was largely a desktop study where we looked at the available literature, both peer-reviewed and grey literature, expert input and review, and we conducted a couple of workshops where we had experts in the room to help inform the assessment of these risks. Okay, and you can see the likelihood rating scale there from things that are almost certain not to happen right through to almost certain to happen by the 2050s. Next slide, please.
And thanks, Dominique, and just giving a 5-minute warning or so for context.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, for our consequences, we were interested in breaking down an assessment of consequences to get a more nuanced understanding of what the impacts were for these particular risk events. So rather than just looking at an overall consequence, we divided this up into a number of things. So the impact to loss of life or serious injury or harm, psychological impacts, loss of social cohesion, loss of cultural resources and natural resources, loss of economic productivity, loss of infrastructure services, and cost to provincial government, which is particularly important for us because we're using this information to inform our decision makers about potential risks, and they need to know what the potential costs are for them. So we've got an asterisk there against the loss of cultural resources. This was included in our framework. However, we didn't actually assess the impacts to cultural resources in our risk assessment. And I'll get into that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to make you aware of that. So like I said, this was based on a range of information based on peer-reviewed and grey literature and input from experts and participation during workshops. And once again, we used a consequence rating scale from 1 to 5, and each consequence was averaged based on an analysis of each of those particular consequences. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a look at the overall results. This is a standard risk matrix where you've got likelihood multiplied by consequence, and the overall risk score ranges from low in the bottom left-hand corner in the green there through to extreme in the top right corner. And for each of the 15 risk events, you can see them plotted on that figure. Our highest overall risks were severe wildfire season, seasonal water shortage, heat wave, ocean acidification, glacier mass loss, and long-term water shortage. So for us, most of these results weren't surprising. We were expecting to see, high risk of future wildfire and water shortage and flooding events in the future. Ocean acidification was a surprise for us that it ranked so highly in this assessment, and that's largely driven by the fact that this is the reduction in pH is almost certain to happen by the 2050s. So we're likely, this is a risk that is likely to be played out if we continue on the emissions path that we're on today. So the other thing that you'll see in this graph is that we have each of those risk events are color-coded according to what we're calling confidence levels, so ranging from low to high. And this is just a reflection of the quality of information that we had to go on for each risk assessment. So if there was a wealth of information from multiple sources that were peer-reviewed and they had a high degree of agreement in their findings, then that would result in a high confidence that the information is accurate. And on the other scale, low confidence might suggest that there was not very much in the available literature, or it was based largely on opinion, or that there wasn't a good agreement in the findings that we were able to assess. And in the case of ocean acidification, it gets a low confidence rating, mostly because a lot of the studies were drawn by inferring what's likely to happen in BC from other parts of the globe where this work has done, and it was the availability of the information at the time. We recognize there have been a number of studies that have come out since then to further our knowledge in this area, which would boost that confidence rating. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just another way of looking at the results. We've got the 15 risk events along the bottom there, and each histogram bar represents the breakdown of those risks by the different consequence events. So this, the consequence category. So this tells you a couple of things. The black dots along there are the overall risk score. So they're ranging from highest to lowest, left to right. And you can see the magnitude of the consequences for each of these risks. And this tells us a couple of things. Firstly, what we're seeing is that many of the risks that have high consequences, it's driven by having high consequence ratings across multiple criteria. So in the case of ocean acidification, there are significant consequences to a number of factors such as loss of economic productivity, loss of natural resources, psychological and impacts and loss of social cohesion, which are things that you might expect for this particular scenario. The other interesting thing about this figure is that we have a couple of risk events that are quite far down. They're quite a bit lower in their overall risk rating, that being severe river flooding and severe coastal storm surge. However, the overall risk of these events is low because of their likelihood of occurring. However, the consequences of these particular events is extremely high. So it also suggests that even though these events aren't particularly likely to happen, the consequences of them occurring are really devastating. So that's worth further attention as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish up here by talking a little bit about our next steps. As I mentioned, in the risk framework that we developed, we had a category for considering the loss of cultural resources. However, given that this was a desktop study where we didn't conduct any engagement with Indigenous nations in BC on what the impacts to their cultural resources could be, we didn't feel that it was that the information that we had was adequate to really address that perspective, and so we didn't include it in the initial assessment. And we recognize that there's further work that needs to be done in this area. So we've begun additional engagement with Indigenous communities through the development of our climate preparedness and adaptation strategy. And we've been talking to communities about how we can conduct risk assessments in a way that's culturally appropriate and how that might help us inform our future risk assessments. So this work is ongoing. The other pieces that we're also looking at is doing an equity analysis. So understanding how these different risk events might disproportionately affect different types of communities based on gender or race or a socioeconomic background, that type of thing. And we're also, we've had a great deal of interest in our risk assessment and in a lot of questions from local governments and other people asking how can we scale this risk assessment for use in our own area. So we're looking at how we can adapt the methodology to be applicable at different geographic scales, or in the scale like looking at specific sectors or risks rather than an overall risk assessment approach. And like I said, this risk assessment helped to inform the first report on our climate-related risks that was published under the Act last year, and there is a requirement that we continue to report on climate-related risks every 5 years, and to report on what we're doing to address those risks every year. So I'll leave it there, and as with the other panelists, I'm happy to take questions at the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dominique. That was a great presentation and a different approach, as you note, to sort of this topic. And I think it's important to demonstrate that there is sort of lots of different approaches to this. And ideally, from the Alliance perspective, we want ocean acidification, coastal acidification, understanding science, research, monitoring priorities and local response strategies as sort of baked in, and as part of these climate, larger climate mitigation, adaptation, resiliency strategies. And so it really is a great example of that starting to emerge, and so really appreciate you sharing today to give that type of example. So I have a quick question here before we get to two more. They'll probably be a little bit shorter presentations, but those were great and comprehensive. You guys have talked about the scenario, using, and this is, I guess I should give you all a heads up. This is for Dr. Joanna Johnson and for Dr. Cooley, if I still have you on the line. The question is, both presentations have used the RCP 8.5 scenario for pH reduction projections by 2050. And are there alternatives that one would suggest, or is that sort of been the standard approach from that global stock take, and that was more or less consistent with the other assumptions made across other topics? But Dominique, if you want to take that one, you're welcome to, but I know you're not I don't want to put you on the spot as the non-OA expert. I'm sympathetic to that role.
No, and I mean, we also used RCP 8.5 for our risk assessment, and I guess I can speak to it from that perspective. There's a couple of reasons why we chose that. In fact, you can jump to a couple of slides from now, and I've actually got a figure that discusses that a little bit, if it's still up there. But really, that's what we call a high emissions scenario, and or business as usual. I'm assuming high emissions that will continue. I think when you're trying to understand risk, the precautionary principle applies. You want to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So that was one argument for using a high emission scenario. The other point for us is that by 2050, there's not a great deal of divergence in the impact that the temperature changes. I can't speak to pH, but in the temperature changes on a RCP 8.5 compared to RCP 4.5, which is like the equivalent to the Paris Agreement targets, they're still essentially the same by 2050. So, you're looking at the same degree of risk in the future. It's not until much later on in the century that those two emission scenarios really diverge in their impact on temperature for British Columbia.
Dr. Johnson, do you want to add anything to that from a ocean acidification unique sort of perspective?
No, I think that was a really good description. I think, as you say, when you're trying to understand risk or vulnerability, using the higher emission scenario is a good way to go. Well, currently we're sort of tracking that way anyway, but also it gives you, if you like, the worst case scenario. So from a precautionary approach, if you can address that, then if we're fortunate enough to reduce emissions, you'll be addressing any future scenario. The other thing, exactly as Dominic said, is that there's really not much divergence, even with ocean acidification, until right at the end of the century. So it's good. And a lot of the projections are focusing when you try and get downscaled information. So we were trying to get as downscaled information as possible for the Pacific. And again, most of that is available for that RCP 8.5.
Great, thanks both so much. And that presentation, Dominique, was a good segue, I think, to our next speaker, who's going to talk a little bit about a project that is still ongoing here in the West Coast of North America that talks about how to more intentionally think about this integrated social ecological vulnerability assessment. And really thrilled to have Dr. Jan Newton, who's one of the leads on this project, to talk through the components of it, but also noting that this will be queuing up, I think, a longer webinar, workshop, however we want to call it, for a future longer discussion, because this is a really interesting project and really want to get more perspectives and takeaways, I think, from how this is going, what lessons learned and takeaways will be. So Dr. Newton, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Thank you for inviting me. And so if I could have the first slide.
Oh, is that not? Let's see. Oh, gosh.
That would be useful.
There
we go. Okay, so this isn't really the title of the talk, but it is a slide I often use. Ocean acidification, a global issue with local effects. And if you look at those pictures along the bottom, one is from Washington State, one's from Fiji, one's from the Caribbean, and one's from New Zealand. You see people in all of those, but you see different habitat, and you can't necessarily see different organisms, but we know that to be true. And so it's really important, if we're going to do a regional vulnerability assessment, that we think on that local scale. So next slide. So it was really exciting when NOAA's ocean acidification program put a competition for regional vulnerability assessments, which really asked for the integration of social science with natural science in order to do that. And so it really, I wouldn't say force, but it really gave the impetus to working together as social scientists and natural scientists, and really thinking through how are we going to inform each other. So next slide. So this is the project that evolved, the one that I'm involved with. It's from Washington State, the Olympic Coast as a Sentinel. And I really want to acknowledge the co-authors here, primarily Melissa Poe, who's my co-principal investigator. She is a social scientist. I am a natural scientist. And so working with others who you see listed here, we devised how this project would fit together and the steps that it would go through. Now, the local environment at the Olympic Coast is home to 4 treaty tribes of Washington State. And it's really important, as we were making these regional vulnerability assessments, we made them with these tribes. And so you see, if you can read the attributions here, people's affiliations, you see Quinault Indian Nation, Makah tribe, Ho tribe, Quileute tribe as co-PIs from the get-go in the co-design. And that's really critical. We also had federal and local partners, and then Washington Sea Grant, which has really helped with the communication aspect of this. So this project couldn't happen without any one of those co-PIs. And so that's part of my message. Next slide. All right, so what's specific about the Olympic coast of Washington State? It has high oceanographic variation. There's seasonal upwelling and downwelling. There's spatial gradients from north to south. And Adrienne Sutton, in a paper where she compared moorings from around the world, said the Cheba mooring, which is the mooring off of La Push there, has the highest subseasonal variability of all mooring sites in the NOAA OAP global network. And so this is important. Is variability, is that going to make species more robust or closer to thresholds that push them over? But who cares? Well, indigenous coastal tribes who have lived there from time immemorial and have a very high ocean dependency. So here's a quote from Joe Schumacher with the Quinault Indian Nation. The tribes of the West Coast of the US are literally on the front line of OA impacts. We have a responsibility to know so we can plan for an uncertain future. Next slide. So that's the impetus, and our goal, I can't believe this is actually one sentence, but I'll step you through it. Our overarching goal is to provide an assessment of coupled social ecological vulnerability to effects from ocean acidification that is based on new social science that Melissa and her team led, and a synthesis of existing data and model projections, that I worked primarily with others, and our modeler was Sam Sidlecki. Relevant to the Olympic coast, its biological resources and its inhabitants, including participating coastal tribes, and that it's developed in an actionable interdisciplinary approach that strengthens the capabilities for vulnerable place-based communities to adapt, and two, is transferable to other locations. So that's what we're really excited about, is figuring out an approach that really works at a local setting and then hopefully is transferable. So let me walk you through our approach. Next slide. All right, so we call this affectionately the wheel, and it might be a little hard for you to read. I'm actually going to ask Jessie if you could click one more time.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so now these steps are color coded. The pink is, or the salmon color, I should say, is social science activities. The green is natural science, and the purple is modeling projections, and then the white is everything together. Okay, so first, defining the scope of the place-based risk environment by identifying local management and policy priorities and community needs. So Melissa and her team did that, as well as determining the social importance of key OA sensitive marine species and the role that these species play in community well-being. Then I worked with Olympic National Park, the OCNMS, Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, the state, the tribes, NOAA, federal, a whole cast of characters to synthesize existing chemical and biological data sets, analyzing variability in space and time. Sam Sidlecki and her group, including a graduate student, Holly Berger, who's on the line today, worked on, she used a regional ocean model. It's a ROMS-based model. It's forced by CMIP 5. If you're a modeler, you know what that means, but that's a global model. And so this model was then used to make future projections that could, on a spatial scale, identify the regions and the timing of where OA conditions will cross thresholds that could be interpreted for key species of interest to the community. And then this next step is the one that we kind of got hung up on for a while, is to estimate the risk of direct and indirect OA impacts to key biological resources that are important to the community partners. And we had one approach, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into how we're doing that, but a great discussion I had with Shallon Bush has given us a wonderful approach that's very similar to how it, other risk estimation is done at the IPCC level. Then the next step is to synthesize the socioeconomic data, analyze the spatially scaled factors that affect the vulnerability, assess then the social vulnerability to OA through workshops where we bring this all together, and then identify that the tribes can self-identify community-driven strategies for responding to threats and increasing their adaptive capacity. And so then lastly, to engage with and provide the information to decision makers to prepare for and respond to the vulnerabilities. And then the last one is kind of your classic lather, rinse, repeat, because we know nothing's static. We are in the progress of this. COVID really affected the ability to have some of these workshops. And so we're really excited about taking this approach and making sure that it's working for a local setting, and then publishing it so that then others may use it in other locations. And so the last slide is just, it's a bit of an eye chart. Just focus on the big words. These are our project outcomes. We believe that the information will add to tribal resilience because tribal decision makers can then look at the risk. So we're going to look at the projections relative to the current status and see where the biggest difference is. And then because we have these maps of where the species of interest are, we will be able to show where there might be vulnerabilities. And our attempt to look in the literature for thresholds is just not panning out. But as Shallon advised us, use a thought process. Assume a threshold of 7.6, then assume a threshold of 7.2. And nobody really knows the threshold of an olive snail, but we can make some assumptions and see where those choke points are. So that information in the hands of the people who depend on these fisheries, sustainable fisheries, science application to management for the tribes as well as the state, science application to policy, increased awareness, and then our ultimate goal is transfer to other areas. So in a nutshell, that's what we've got, and I'm happy to take questions.
Great, thanks so much, Jan. That's a great overview. And as mentioned, what this is still ongoing and lots to take away, I think, from what this process has been and all the actors engaged in it. So we'll be reaching out to all of the co-PIs, or as you put it, all the folks that are engaged in the project, and thinking about how to set up another program subsequently that really dives into the details of this project. So if you're interested in something like that, please reach out and stay engaged. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to our last speaker, Dr. Shaltut, and I'm so honored to have you here with us, Naira, to kind of close us out and give us some of your thinking on this from a more application standpoint. And so Dr. Shaltut is serving as the executive on the executive committee of the Global Ocean Acidification and Observing Network, as co-chair of OA Africa Network, and a member of the Mediterranean OA Network, and member of the National Institute of Fisheries Science Committee for the IOC UNESCO Commission. So, really what we are so excited to hear from you is sort of how you're thinking about OA impacts on Mediterranean region's blue economy, and some of the discussions that you're having with partners in the region, both from a science perspective, but also from a policy perspective, and sort of what your experience has been like in that regard. And what I'll note for folks is, obviously there's going to be a lot a lot to chew on from these sets of discussions. And so instead of moving into a roundtable after this, which I don't think we'll have a ton of time to do, what I'd suggest is I have a couple written questions that I was going to ask in the roundtable. I'm going to ask our presenters to write down their responses to those. And then if you have any questions from today, please reach out to me directly, or feel free to type them in the chat box here, and we'll include those. And so we can sort of issue a little summary report from this workshop or from this webinar with some of this more discussion and answering your questions directly. So I think that's the approach we'll take for today. Okay, so thank you so much. And Dr. Shaltut, I know that you're going to share your screen. Is that?
Yes, yeah, okay. Morning, everybody. I'm sorry, good afternoon and good night, okay.
Good evening to you, and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jessie, for the invitation for this workshop. And it's very interesting to listen all my colleagues for their presentation. And I'm very happy to share my expertise on Mediterranean Sea ocean acidification impact on blue economy. Okay. Why Mediterranean Sea is such important? Because it has 30%, it contains 30% of global seaborne trade by volume and about a quarter of oil traffic. It hosts 450 ports and terminals. It's the second largest market of cruise ships. Although it's a semi-closed basin, but it's surrounded by a large number of cultural diversity and geopolitical complexity due to the different culture of different countries surrounded Mediterranean Sea. Safety and security issue in the Mediterranean Sea is much important and make it important to save its blue economy and socio-economy state. Coastal pressure from different pollutant land-based sources, rivers discharge, and intense activities of fishing and oil and gas extractions, different exploration. So it's highly impacted by coastal pressure. And one of the main issues is resources over exploration. It has also a unique biodiversity. It contains 400 UNESCO sites and 236 marine protected areas. And it's very important for its culture of environmental health life. What are the types of, blue economy? It's extraction of living resources, professionals such as professional fisheries, recreational fisheries, and marine aquaculture. The second is extraction of non-living resources, marine mining. The third is energy production, marine renewable energy, oil and gas exploration, land-based activities from land-based sources and coastal development. Transportation, maritime transportation is one of the most important activities in Mediterranean Sea. And the last is tourism. For the fisheries and aquaculture contribute to the economy of the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea. It provides food and employment for the coastal communities, employing more than 785,000 people in 2018, within about 4.1 billion euros and 353,000 direct jobs created in the fisheries and aquaculture industry. That's make any disturbance or any bad impact on fisheries and aquaculture one of the alarming points that must be taken in consideration. Mediterranean Sea is the third most important blue economy sector in the socio-economy term after tourism and maritime. Fisheries is the third after maritime transportation and tourism. So this is, we can, from the figure you see in the screen, I showed in the screen, the changes in the revenue of the marine capture fisheries per year, per fleet segment, changes between the period between 2013 and to 2018, according to the last report of FAO. And you can notice that how this is the different scale, the different vessels and the different ways of fisheries activities in the Mediterranean Sea. And one can notice that there is the peak of the fisheries activities was 2014, and there is a decline in most of the fisheries activities in Mediterranean Sea. The following figures describe how the changes, variation in the capture in the total landing of fisheries in the Mediterranean countries. Some Mediterranean countries suffers decline and reduction in the fisheries in landing amount, and others gained more fisheries production. And this is not totally due to the impact of acidification or climate or other stressors. There are other factors that affect this variation or causes this variation, is new ways of fishing techniques. Some countries use another techniques or more advanced techniques for their production, for their fisheries activities. And for other countries, they impacted by climate change, and such as Morocco, Tunisia, Croatia, Egypt, they suffer from a large decreasing in fisheries landing recorded by FAO. This is the distribution of the countries and the areas by FAO for the countries for the fisheries activities. According to the data, 220,000 fishermen are directly employed in the Mediterranean, and this is the sectors for their this distribution for the fishery employment at the different countries. And when we focus on the impact of the direct effect of ocean acidification, fisheries and aquacultures are impacted by different stressors from pollution, overexploitation, climate change, deoxygenation, eutrophication, and finally ocean acidification. The impact of ocean acidification on fisheries, it affects increasing temperature and heat waves, frequency causing stress and mortality in marine organisms and fisheries in the Mediterranean Sea. The impact of ocean acidification on fisheries can be direct or indirect. The direct effect could be for the calcifiers by decreasing their growth and making their shells more soft and impacting their growth rate. Also, the indirect impact could be on the physiology and on the other organisms that feed on the organisms that's already impacted. OA impacted and changed the trophic web, and the abundance of the marine resources, including both mollusks and fishes, are strongly dependent on the structure and functioning of the regional trophic web. Fish invasion highly increased by both climate change and acidification. Organisms react differently. Some organisms went from ocean acidification and warming, and other affected in a bad way from this changes of climate and acidification. So more information and more research are needed on a regional, local and regional and interregional scale for the Mediterranean and for other countries to have a complete picture about the species that will be highly impacted and species can went from the acidification, because the species went from acidification will be dominant and replaces the species that will affect it, which causes a change in the food web and highly impacting the fishery production. For the aquaculture, the ocean acidification and climate change will impact the mortality, will cause a mass mortality of the larvae and need more adaptation of the small fisheries to be adapted for this severe condition. Regarding the fisheries distribution in Mediterranean Sea, increasing temperature will cause a northward migration of fisheries and changing the distribution of fisheries resources in the whole Mediterranean, which which leads to some countries lose its main resources for food, and which is particularly South Mediterranean countries or developing countries, low income countries will be highly impacted than the North Mediterranean countries. Coming to the second sector, which is the maritime transport, including related port activities, have reported significant growth in the Mediterranean over the past decades. Mediterranean recorded intense maritime transport of goods, energy, product, and passenger. To date, it's the largest load and discharge center for the transport of oil products. Among the Southern Mediterranean countries, Egypt, Morocco has the largest, according to the figure, Egypt and Morocco have the largest, highest number of ports. Egypt's ports infrastructure has developed strongly over the last decades. Between the North Mediterranean countries, Spain comes first in port activities and maritime transportation. I'm sorry. Regarding the economic value and employment for the maritime sector, the total revenue of the sector, the transport service, port activities, and shipbuilding was 7 billion euros, generating a GVA of more than 25 billion euros, about 5% of the industry value worldwide. In terms of employment, it's estimated that about 550,000 jobs are directly created by this industry. How ocean acidification and climate will impact maritime sector? Acidification will significantly change biofouling community composition by decrease in calcified and increase in soft bodies organism. Moreover, dense population of macroalgae. It will also affect rate of leaching and dissolution of toxic ions and hydrolysis of copolymers of coating, because coating chemistry, temperature, pH, and flow dependent on marine fouling they are pH and flow dependent. Marine fouling generates surface roughness and increase the drag resistance of a ship moving through water, and consequently increases fuel consumption and emission of greenhouse gases. Heavily calcareous fouling may result in powering penalties of more than 85%. Coming to the last sector, tourism. The Mediterranean is the world leading tourist destination, both in the international and domestic tourism. And coming to, from the economy point of view, the number had increased to 314 millions, and the region was expected to attract 355 million in 2016. The impact of ocean acidification on tourism, that climate change will control the length and quality of tourism season. So the area of tourism, tourist destination will change it. And by increasing temperature, the season and the area of the direction of the tourism will be moved to another countries. So the low economic countries of the South Mediterranean will lose another source of income. In addition, ocean acidification will increase the habitat destruction, reduce the coastal biodiversity, increase the invasive species, and also the decrease in pH can decrease metabolism and the growth of cold water coral, while body skeleton dissolves in unsaturated water. Warm water cooler have a reduction in growth and calcification rates. And all of these factors will impact the tourism activities in Mediterranean Sea. Coming conclusively, okay.
Go ahead.
Conclusively, climate change, acidification, pollution, resources, and resources over-exploitation will decrease fisheries landing, decrease fisheries trading, reduce aquaculture, reduce tourism, and will impact maritime. And this will lead to low income and losing jobs, leading to increasing poverty and increasing migration on regional and local and regional scale. Thank you. And I can share my expertise for the Mediterranean for just 5 minutes. For the Mediterranean and for the ocean acidification for Africa. On the Mediterranean scale, we started to share a project and write proposals to have a full picture, approximately more information about the impacted species, and to evaluate the situation of ocean acidification through cooperation and integration work between Mediterranean countries, North Mediterranean countries, and South and East Mediterranean countries. In addition, for Africa, we started preparation in guidance of IAEA and in support of GOA to prepare the policy document to support the ocean acidification and climate change, to simplify the information, put more socio-economic impacts in these documents, make it simple to raise the awareness of public awareness and the policymaker. The academia and the government work together in parallel to spreading the information of ocean acidification impacts on resources and fisheries and other economic sectors to increase the, to facilitate the action, look for the more mitigation action rather than adaptation, also to decrease the pollution, to go for more sustainable resources, and to go for more renewable energy and decreasing greenhouse emissions. Thank you. Thanks for your patience. I know that I took more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaltut. It's lovely to have you here today, and I really appreciate your presentation, but also sort of conclusive thoughts on the projects and the products that you're continuing to work to engage governments and other communities with. And knowing we're wrapping up here, and again, asking participants to email me directly with questions or put questions in the chat box, and we'll pull them together and get everyone a written response and make a little summary document for fun. I did want to ask you, Dr. Shaltut, just to give us your closing thoughts. I mean, you have been engaging with policymakers in the region on this topic, and both in the Mediterranean region, and of course, as part of your work as OA Africa. But what's your general take of government leaders' reception to this topic? Has it been useful to frame it in these other priorities, like the sectors you mentioned? And has it been difficult to describe ocean acidification as relevant to those topics? What's your general takeaway as far as what you think policymakers really need to know coming with some of these impacts?
We started our trial to increase the public awareness, and the policymaker grabbed their attention for the impact of ocean acidification since 2014. At the beginning, they can't imagine that how 0.1 pH unit can cause all these impacts. So we, at the beginning, we start spreading the information of the impact of climate change and how it will impact, and how climate change, global warming, and ocean acidification will magnify the impact of climate change, and the warming with acidification will magnify the impact of acidification. Then we go through every events and every time for setting projects and spreading more information, grabbing the policymakers for marine spatial planning policy for different countries, for Egypt, for Morocco, and for Algeria. In addition, for the for African countries, for the East Africa countries, we start working for this. How can setting the marine spatial planning conserve our marine resources and decrease the impact of ocean acidification. After that, we work with the environmental Ministry of Environmental Affairs, in cooperation with the ministry, and starting from the governorate, one governorate in Egypt, in each country, and start to reach our voice to this governorate. It's a coastal governorate, and raise the awareness, public awareness, did a lot of workshops, spreading more information, very simple information on the impact. Because when you talk with the policymaker for the language, by the language they can understand, which is money, when you transfer the information, scientific information, into money, they can, you can grab their attention and faster action. After that, we include students and different university and different NGOs. This is followed by inclusion of industry. Finally, I can say that we have a voice of the impact of ocean acidification, and now they hear and understand that it's one of the most important. If we need to conserve the biodiversity, marine biodiversity, and the blue economy, we need to work hard for the mitigation of climate change and reducing the ocean acidification. And that's why for Egypt, I know that they took large steps forward for the moving to sustainable renewable energy and decreasing carbon dioxide emission. In addition, in Africa, by the help of Africa Bank, Egypt and different experts from Morocco lead the spreading of transformation from fuel energy to solar energy and wind energy in Africa, by the support of UN.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shaltut. That's, I think, a good, putting it in context that they care about, right, is a great way to think about how we continue to engage governments and work with government and community members and different stakeholders to start thinking about how we really assess the full scope of risk and vulnerabilities assessment and the cost, the economic cost, as well as the social, cultural costs of what those impacts are going to be. So I think that's a great way to end today. And like I said, I'm super grateful for all our panelists and I guess presenters would be the right word, and sending appreciation. We will follow up with questions and answers to those questions. And I just end by saying this is a very new discussion about how governments and other partners are putting these assessments together. So more to come on sharing other examples, other case stories, other lessons learned, and thank you for joining today.